Welcome back. We're discussing the We Charity alleged scandal that happened in 2020 and what has come out of that. Was it really a scandal? What responsibility do us in the media play for maybe a big pylon that maybe there was just no fire when we reported smoke? Well, joining me again is Tawfiq Rangwala, who's the author of a book on the devolvement of the scandal. And again, thank you so much for joining me. So before we went for commercial break, we're discussing, again, this allegation that perhaps there was only ever smoke and not fire. And, I'm a journalist. I do my very best to fact check. But the news cycle moves so quickly. And when journalists are reporting certain things, you expect that they have done their due diligence. And when we bring them on as guests, we bring them on as an expert and we ask the questions. So I guess my question to you then is, does the media, do journalists have a misinformation problem?
Well, I think they do. I think this story reveals that some of our most, venerated sources of news, in Canada, including the CBC, I think there's a real tendency to just assume that journalists have done their homework and that if they're presenting it to you, that they've already done the background work, they've checked with the sources, they've looked into it. And I think what this scandal revealed to me in a very powerful way that I didn't appreciate, I must say, was that that's just often not the case. And particularly when you have a fast-moving story where there is a real interest level in understanding what's going on, I think there's a real tendency, a drive towards sensationalism. And when people ask for corrections or when people point out that, the story is not being covered accurately, I think there's a real tendency to gloss over that or to skip over what I would call the boring parts. One thing I'll just say, Tanya, and I'll let you ask a question is, for me, one of the motivations in writing this book is there was almost no mention by the media. And 125,000 articles, no mention of children, teachers, students, or impoverished people in communities around the world. In other words, no one cared in the media about the beneficiaries of We Charity. So if you look at all the reporting, it's basically saying, well, this is an interesting political story. What did We Charity do? Let's talk about these Kielburger brothers. But the question of, what about 7,000 schools in Canada that lost mental health programming because We Charity in Canada had to close? What about thousands of Indigenous people who don't have suicide prevention treatment anymore? What about millions of children in Kenya or Ecuador and India who don't have access to clean drinking water anymore as a result of political choices in Canada? And the media really just entirely ignored that question. For 25 years, millions of Canadian young people and teachers had been benefiting from We Schools programming, We Charity school programming on service learning. It's gone in Canada and no one talked about it. And that just blew my mind.
I think for me, one of the interesting, because I've actually followed the We Charity for about 20 years, because I used to do work at the lobbying at the United Nations, and I remember them in the early 2000s, late 90s coming to, and I was like, oh, look, Canada's really taking a center stage here. This is great. And I followed some of their activities. I think it was maybe a perfect storm. You had many folks at home forcibly because COVID lockdowns and people, for some reason, really paying attention to the news. Not for some reason, but for good reason, because, is there a lockdown? What is the outbreak numbers? What's going on with COVID? And then all of a sudden, this inserted the news cycle. But I think what piqued a lot of people's interest is that the government was, again, awarding a close to $1 billion contract to some third-party charity. And I think people didn't know that. Is that done? Is that typical? So I guess I'll ask you, is that typical of governments? You've worked with many organizations. Is that typical for a government to award a contract of that size? And was it? And I think that it raised a lot of eyebrows. And maybe should it not have?
Well, it's a great question. Let me tell you a couple of things about that. One thing is, you said $1 billion contract. It's very interesting. It was actually only 543 million. And the interesting fact is that many politicians called it a $900 million or $1 billion contract. It's completely false. But yet you will see thousands of references to it over and over again because people wanted the soundbite, $1 billion program. Because it sounded worse.
But that was reported widely. It was 940 million. So you're saying that is actually categorically false?
It's just categorical.
Wow.
It's not even a little bit true. But more importantly, and a great anecdote in the book, is the Globe and Mail's editor, Sylvia Steed, there was a request from We Charity they sent to her a request saying, please stop reporting the number falsely. Can you at least report the number accurately? And she responds in an email that I cite in the book, where she says, well, I've Google researched it, and 912 million comes up more times than 543, so we're going to stick with our reporting. And
Oh
you sort of
boy.
pause and you say, wow, that's the Globe and Mail's criteria for whether it's true or false. That's amazing. And it was just about a soundbite. So even though every politician on the right and left of the political spectrum knew that it was not a $900 million program, you will find Charlie Angus in the NDP and Pierre Poilievre constantly using the number, knowing it's false, to try and create a certain impression.